Hi everyone, welcome back to Love in Chapters. Before we dive into today's story, I'd love for you to drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're listening from. I really love seeing how far our stories travel. Also, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you enjoy the story. Now, let's dive in. The late afternoon sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Brian Kingston's corner office, casting long shadows across the mahogany desk that had once belonged to his grandfather. At 32, Brian cut an impressive figure, 6 feet 2 inches of lean muscle wrapped in a bespoke Savile Row suit, dark hair perfectly styled, jaw sharp enough to have graced magazine covers, which it had, multiple times. His steel-gray eyes surveyed the London skyline with the confidence of a man who had inherited not just wealth, but legacy. Kingston Enterprises wasn't just a company, it was an institution. 4 generations of Kingstons had built an empire spanning real estate, technology, and luxury goods. Brian had taken the reins at 28 after his father's retirement, and in 4 years, he'd doubled the company's value. The business world called him the Golden Heir. The society pages called him Britain's most eligible bachelor. That title was about to change. Brian's phone buzzed with a text from Stephanie. "Can't wait to marry you in 4 weeks, my love." A smile tugged at his lips. Stephanie Patterson, beautiful, accomplished, from a family whose wealth rivaled his own. Their engagement had been called the wedding of the decade. Their mothers had been planning it for months, transforming a historic estate into what would undoubtedly be the social event of the year. Everything was perfect, almost too perfect. He didn't see the car coming. One moment, Brian was driving through Mayfair after a late meeting, his mind on wedding preparations and quarterly reports. The next, there was the screech of tires, the crunch of metal, and the world spinning violently before everything went black. He woke up in a private hospital room, surrounded by machines beeping rhythmically. His mother sat beside him, her usually composed face tight with worry. Stephanie stood by the window, her hand pressed against the glass. "Mr. Kingston, you're awake." The doctor entered with a warm smile that did little to ease the tension in the room. "You gave everyone quite a scare." The next hours were a blur of tests, MRIs, blood work, neurological examinations. Brian's body ached, bruises blooming across his torso. But as the results came in, the doctor's smile grew more genuine. "You're remarkably lucky," Dr. Morrison said, reviewing the charts. "No internal bleeding, no fractures, no signs of traumatic brain injury. You have some severe bruising and a mild concussion, but structurally, you're sound. With rest, you should make a full recovery." "The wedding," Brian started, "is in 4 weeks, Dr. Morrison confirmed. "As long as you take it easy for the next 2 weeks, I see no reason why you can't proceed as planned. You're a very fortunate young man, Mr. Kingston." Stephanie rushed to his side, tears streaming down her face. "I thought I'd lost you," she whispered, gripping his hand. "You can't get rid of me that easily," he joked, though his voice was rough. The recovery was faster than anyone expected. Within a week, Brian was back to his morning runs, though he kept them shorter. Within 2 weeks, he was back in the office part-time. By 3 weeks, you'd never know he'd been in an accident at all. If anything, he felt better than before, more energized, more alive, as if the brush with mortality had reset something fundamental in him. The wedding day arrived in a cascade of English roses and champagne. The historic Thornbury estate had been transformed into a fairy tale, with hundreds of guests filling the gardens. Stephanie was breathtaking in her Vera Wang gown, a vision of ivory lace and silk. As she walked down the aisle, Brian felt his chest tighten with emotion. This was it, the beginning of their life together. The ceremony was perfect. The reception was elegant. The toasts were heartfelt. As the evening wound down, and they waved goodbye to their guests, heading to the bridal suite that had been prepared for them, Brian felt a contentment he'd never known. Everything in his life had fallen into place. Stephanie emerged from the bathroom in delicate white lingerie that left little to the imagination. Brian's breath caught. She was gorgeous. He'd always known that. But tonight, as his wife, she seemed to glow with an ethereal beauty. "Come here," he said softly, reaching for her. She moved into his arms, and they kissed deeply. Brian's hands roamed over her body, familiar yet somehow new now that she was his wife. They'd been intimate before, many times during their 2-year courtship. He knew what she liked, how to make her gasp, where to touch her. But as they moved to the bed, as clothing was shed, and skin met skin, something was wrong. Brian felt desire. He wanted her, mentally, emotionally. But his body wasn't responding. He tried to focus, tried to relax, but nothing was happening. Panic began to creep in at the edges of his consciousness. "Hey," Stephanie whispered, sensing his tension. "What's wrong?" I can't." The words stuck in his throat. This had never happened before, ever. Stephanie sat up, concern replacing desire in her eyes. "Are you okay? Does something hurt?" "No, I can't seem to." He couldn't even say it. Brian Kingston, who commanded boardrooms and closed billion-dollar deals, couldn't admit that his body was betraying him on his wedding night. "It's okay," Stephanie said, though he could hear the disappointment threading through her reassurance. "You've had a long day. We've both had a long day. The wedding was exhausting, and you were in an accident just a month ago. Your body probably just needs rest." "Yeah," Brian agreed, grasping at the explanation like a lifeline. "Yeah, it's probably just stress, wedding nerves or something. We have our whole lives," she said, kissing his forehead. "One night doesn't matter." But it did matter. Brian lay awake long after Stephanie fell asleep, staring at the ceiling, fear coiling in his stomach. This couldn't be happening. Not now. Not to him. The next morning, he was sure it had been a fluke. They were on their honeymoon in the Maldives. Pristine beaches, private villa, nothing but time and each other. That night, Stephanie tried again, her touches more deliberate, more encouraging. Brian wanted to respond. God, he wanted to. But his body remained stubbornly uncooperative. "It's okay," Stephanie repeated, but her voice had an edge now. Still, just tired from the wedding. But it wasn't okay. It kept happening. Day after day, night after night. Brian tried everything, changing positions, different times of day, letting Stephanie take the lead. Nothing worked. By the end of their 2-week honeymoon, the elephant in the room had grown so large it was suffocating them both. "Maybe you should see Dr. Morrison," Stephanie suggested one morning over breakfast, her tone carefully neutral. "I will," Brian promised, relief flooding through him that she'd been the one to suggest it. "As soon as we get back." Dr. Morrison ran every test imaginable. Blood work, hormone levels, cardiovascular function, neurological assessments. He examined Brian thoroughly, asked uncomfortable questions about frequency and desire and fantasy. "Physically, you're in excellent shape," Dr. Morrison concluded, sitting across from Brian in his office. "Your testosterone levels are normal. Blood flow is optimal. There's no nerve damage from the accident. By all medical standards, you should be functioning perfectly." "But I'm not," Brian said flatly. "These things can be psychological," the doctor said gently. "Stress, anxiety, even pressure to perform can create a cycle of dysfunction. Have you been under unusual stress lately?" Brian almost laughed. "Besides getting married, running a multi-billion-dollar company, and recovering from a car accident? Nothing out of the ordinary. "I'd like to refer you to a specialist," Dr. Morrison said, "a psychologist who deals with these specific issues." The psychologist was kind, professional, and utterly unable to help. Session after session, Brian talked about his childhood, his relationship with Stephanie, his feelings about the accident. Nothing changed. His body remained unresponsive. Stephanie grew quieter as the weeks passed. The newlywed glow faded from her eyes, replaced by something harder. They'd been married 6 weeks, and they still hadn't consummated their marriage. "Maybe we should try another doctor," Stephanie suggested one evening, her voice tight. "I've seen 3 different doctors," Brian snapped, his frustration boiling over. "They all say the same thing. There's nothing physically wrong with me." "Then what is it?" Her voice rose. "Because this isn't normal, Brian. We used to have a perfectly healthy life. We made love a dozen times before. And now nothing? You think I don't know that?" He stood abruptly, pacing the length of their bedroom. "You think I'm enjoying this? I'm trying, Stephanie. I'm doing everything I can." She softened slightly, crossing to him and taking his hands. "I know. I'm sorry. I miss you. I miss us. I miss us too," he whispered, pulling her close. And he did. But the intimacy they'd once shared felt like it belonged to different people in a different lifetime. That night, Brian called Ted Chambers, his best friend since university, and now his business partner. Ted was one of the few people Brian trusted implicitly. "I need to talk to you about something," Brian said, his voice low even though he was alone in his study. "Something private." They met for drinks at Ted's Club, a discreet establishment where the wealthy went when they needed privacy. In a corner booth, over expensive scotch, Brian told him everything. Ted listened without interruption, his expression growing more concerned as the story unfolded. When Brian finished, Ted was quiet for a long moment. "Mate, that's rough," Ted said finally. "And the doctors really can't find anything wrong?" "Nothing. Physically, I'm perfect. It's like my mind wants one thing and my body is doing something completely different." Ted took a long sip of his drink. "I'm going to suggest something, and I want you to hear me out before you react." Brian nodded warily. "What if it's not psychological? What if it's specific?" "What do you mean? What if you're not attracted to Stephanie anymore? Physically, I mean." Brian's first instinct was to argue, but Ted held up a hand. "I know what you're going to say. You were attracted to her before the wedding. You've been together for 2 years, all of that. But sometimes things change. Sometimes our bodies know things our minds don't want to admit." "That's ridiculous," Brian said, but doubt crept into his voice. "We had a healthy, intimate life for 2 years. This just started after the accident." "Then, let's test it," Ted said. "Let's see if you can respond to other women." "You want me to cheat on my wife?" "No, I want you to figure out what's wrong so you can fix it. Look, we'll arrange something private, controlled, just to see if the issue is specific to Stephanie, or if it's across the board. If you can't respond to anyone, then we know it's not about her. If you can." Ted trailed off meaningfully. "This is insane," Brian said, but he was already considering it. The alternative, living like this indefinitely, watching his marriage crumble, was worse. "Think about it," Ted urged. "But if you do this, you need to tell Stephanie first. You can't lie to her about this." That conversation with Stephanie was the hardest thing Brian had ever done. They were in their bedroom, the space that had become a minefield of tension and unspoken disappointments. Ted suggested something, Brian started, unable to meet her eyes. "Something to help us figure out what's wrong." "What kind of something?" Stephanie's voice was guarded. He thinks maybe we should test whether the problem is specific to you or if it's general." Stephanie was silent for so long that Brian finally looked up, Her face had gone pale, then red, her hands clenching into fists. "He wants you to sleep with other women," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Your best friend suggested you cheat on me to fix our marriage." "Not sleep with," Brian said quickly. "Just see if I respond. If I can't, then we know the problem isn't about you specifically. If I can, then we know there's something psychological about our relationship that we need to work through. Are you listening to yourself?" Stephanie's voice rose to a near shout. "You want to parade yourself in front of other women to prove what? That I'm not attractive enough for you? That our marriage is somehow defective? That's not what I'm saying." "Then, what are you saying, Brian?" Tears streamed down her face now. "Because from where I'm standing, my husband of 6 weeks wants permission to see if other women turn him on because apparently I don't anymore." "Stephanie, please, get out," she said coldly. "Just get out." Brian slept in the guest room that night, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, wondering how his life had imploded so completely in such a short time. 3 days of silence followed. They moved around each other like ghosts, barely speaking except when necessary. Brian buried himself in work. Stephanie spent hours on the phone with friends, her voice a low murmur behind closed doors. On the 4th day, she found him in his study. "I've been thinking about Ted's suggestion," she said without preamble. "It's humiliating and horrible, but I need to know. I need to know if this is about me or if it's something else. So fine, do it, but I have conditions." End quote. Brian looked up, hope and dread warring in his chest. "Anything. It has to be completely anonymous. We can't risk anyone knowing about this. Our reputations, our families, the company. Everything could be destroyed if this got out." "Of course," Brian agreed immediately. "And I want to be there," Stephanie continued, her voice hardening. "I need to see it with my own eyes. I'm not waiting at home while you're off with God knows who." Brian nodded slowly. He understood. In her position, he'd want the same thing. Ted arranged everything with his characteristic efficiency. A private lounge, exclusive and discreet, where the wealthy came for entertainment that never made it into the tabloids. For the right price, they'd have the entire place to themselves for an evening. "We'll need masks," Ted said when he briefed them. "For your protection. The women will wear them too. Complete anonymity on both sides." The night of the experiment, as they'd started calling it, felt surreal. Brian, dressed in his most expensive suit, though he wasn't sure why it mattered. Stephanie wore a cocktail dress and heels, her face made up perfectly, every inch the society wife. Only her eyes betrayed her. They were hard, defensive, already wounded by what was to come. Ted picked them up in his car, and they drove through London in silence. The lounge was in Mayfair, tucked away on a quiet street, its entrance unmarked. Inside, it was all dark wood and burgundy velvet, sultry lighting and soft music. A woman in an elegant black dress met them, her own face covered by an ornate mask. "Everything is prepared as requested," she said in accented English. "Complete privacy. The performers have all signed non-disclosure agreements." They were led to a private room, larger than Brian expected, with a single leather chair positioned in the center. Smaller chairs lined the walls. It looked less like a strip club and more like a very exclusive theater. "I'll sit here," Ted said, taking a chair near the door. Stephanie chose a seat directly across from the leather chair, where she'd have a perfect view of everything. Her face was unreadable behind her mask. Brian sat in the center chair, feeling exposed and ridiculous. His heart was pounding, but not with arousal, with dread. The first woman entered. She was tall, blonde, curves poured into a deep red dress that left nothing to the imagination. She moved with practiced grace, her body undulating to the music that had begun playing softly. She circled Brian's chair, her fingers trailing across his shoulders, down his chest. She moved in front of him, her movements becoming more explicit, more suggestive. Brian felt nothing. Intellectually, he could appreciate that she was beautiful, but his body remained completely unresponsive. After 15 minutes, she left. The second woman entered, petite, dark-haired, different from the first in every way. She tried a different approach, more playful, more aggressive. She straddled his lap, pressed herself against him, whispered things in his ear that would have made him blush a year ago. Nothing. The third woman was Asian, elegant, with a seductive grace that was almost artistic. She touched him, encouraged him to touch her. Brian's hands felt like they belonged to someone else as he went through the motions. Nothing. They tried pairs, two women working together, creating scenarios that were explicitly designed to arouse. They tried different types, different approaches, different everything. Nothing, nothing, nothing. Brian watched Stephanie from the corner of his eye. Her face had gone from hard to shocked to something that looked almost like horror. Even Ted, who'd suggested this whole thing, looked increasingly disturbed as woman after woman failed to elicit any response. After the eighth woman, one quote, or maybe it was the ninth, Brian had lost count. The door closed and stayed closed. The experiment was over. The three of them sat in silence in that velvet-draped room. Brian felt empty, hollowed out by humiliation and failure. At least now they knew. The problem wasn't specific to Stephanie. It was him, just him. "Let's go home," Stephanie said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The drive back was silent. At the house, Ted squeezed Brian's shoulder. "We'll figure this out, mate. There has to be an answer." But there wasn't. They tried more specialists, endocrinologists, urologists, neurologists, even alternative medicine practitioners. They tried medications, therapies, lifestyle changes. Nothing worked. Brian was, by all medical accounts, perfectly healthy, and completely unable to function in bed. 2 months into their marriage, Stephanie stopped sleeping in their bedroom. She'd claimed the guest room, and the distance between them grew from a few doors to what felt like miles. 3 months in, Brian made a suggestion he immediately regretted. They were eating dinner in silence, something that had become routine. When he finally spoke, "What if you got something to help you?" he said quietly. "A toy or something. I know it's not the same, but at least." The fork clattered against Stephanie's plate. "A toy?" Her voice was ice. "You want me to use a toy because my husband is completely useless? That's not what I meant, isn't it?" She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You knew, didn't you? You knew about this condition before we got married." "What? No, The accident was a month before the wedding, Brian. 1 month. And suddenly you can't perform? You trapped me." Her voice rose to a shout. "You knew you were broken, and you married me anyway. You trapped me in this loveless marriage." "That's not true." Brian stood too, his own anger rising. "I didn't know. I was cleared by doctors. I thought I was fine. But you weren't fine, were you? And now I'm stuck with you, stuck in this nightmare. And you're suggesting I buy a goddamn toy to make myself feel better? I'm trying to help. You want to help?" Stephanie's laugh was bitter. "File for divorce. Set me free from this disaster." She stormed out, and Brian heard the guest room door slam hard enough to shake the walls. That night marked a turning point. They were no longer just struggling, they were breaking, and Brian had no idea how to stop it. He lay alone in the master bedroom that had once been theirs, staring at the ceiling, and felt the weight of his failing marriage crushing down on him. The accident had taken more from him than anyone realized. It had taken his confidence, his relationship, his sense of self, and worst of all, no one could tell him why or how to get it back. Tomorrow, he'd try again. He'd call another specialist. schedule another appointment, hope for another miracle. But tonight, in the dark, Brian Kingston, CEO, heir, husband, allowed himself to admit what he'd been denying for months. He was terrified. The fertility specialist's office was decorated in calming neutrals, soft grays and pale blues. Abstract art on the walls meant to soothe anxious couples. Brian sat rigidly in the leather chair, Stephanie beside him but miles away, her posture indicating she'd rather be anywhere else. They hadn't touched since entering the building, hadn't even made eye contact in the waiting room. Dr. Helena Winters was in her 50s, with kind eyes that had probably witnessed countless couples in crisis. She reviewed the test results on her tablet, her expression carefully neutral in that way medical professionals perfected. "Mr. Kingston, Mrs. Kingston," she began, setting down the tablet. "I've reviewed all the tests we ran last week, and I need to discuss the results with you both." Brian's jaw tightened. Another dead end, another specialist with no answers. He'd heard it all before. Physically fine, psychologically complex, try to reduce stress. The same useless platitudes. "Your hormone levels are within normal range," Dr. Winters continued. "Blood flow, cardiovascular health, all perfectly adequate. However, there is one significant finding." She paused, and Brian's stomach dropped. That pause was never good. "Your sperm analysis shows severely compromised motility and morphology. In layman's terms, your sperm quality is very low, Mr. Kingston. You're not infertile, but you would be classified as subfertile. Natural conception would be extremely difficult, though not impossible." The words hit Brian like a physical blow. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Not only could he not perform sexually, but even if he could, he probably couldn't give Stephanie children. The one thing they'd talked about wanting, the family they'd planned, all of it slipping through his fingers like sand. How difficult? Stephanie's voice was hollow, emotionless. "Without intervention, I'd estimate less than a 5% chance of natural conception per cycle. We could explore options, IVF, ICSI, sperm extraction procedures, ICSI, but there are no guarantees." "Could the car accident have caused this?" Brian asked, his voice rough. Dr. Winters considered. "Trauma can affect sperm production temporarily, but usually it's reversible within a few months. However, in rare cases, if there was injury to blood vessels or nerve pathways, it could be more persistent. We'd need more tests to determine the cause definitively. More tests, more appointments, more hope dangled and snatched away." "What about the other issue?" Stephanie asked bluntly. "The impotence? That's more complex," Dr. Winters admitted. "Psychological factors often." "I don't want to hear about psychological factors," Stephanie interrupted, her composure cracking. "Every doctor says the same thing. It's psychological. Reduce stress, try therapy. Nothing helps, nothing changes." "Mrs. Kingston, I understand your frustration. Do you?" Stephanie turned to look at the doctor fully. "Do you understand what it's like to be 29 years old and trapped in a marriage with no intimacy, no hope of children, nothing but expensive doctors telling you to be patient?" "Stephanie," Brian said quietly, but she ignored him. "We've been patient. We've tried everything. And now you're telling me that even if he could perform, we probably still couldn't have children. So what exactly are we doing here?" Dr. Winters maintained her professional calm. "We could begin fertility treatments while continuing to address the erectile dysfunction. Many couples successfully—" "I need air." Stephanie stood abruptly, grabbing her purse. "I can't do this right now." She walked out, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor. Brian sat frozen, humiliation burning through him. Dr. Winters offered more information, more possibilities, more false hope. Brian heard himself agreeing to more tests, more consultations, knowing it was pointless. In the car, Stephanie stared out the window, her jaw set. Brian tried to find words that might bridge the chasm between them. "We could try IVF," he offered. "Money isn't an issue. We could go to the best clinics. I don't want to talk about it. Stephanie, please. We need to discuss." "What is there to discuss, Brian?" She turned to him, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. "You're broken. Our marriage is broken. A baby won't fix that." The word broken echoed in Brian's head long after she'd gone silent again. Broken. That's what he was. A broken husband. A broken man. The deterioration happened gradually at first, then all at once, like a building with a cracked foundation that suddenly collapses. Stephanie grew colder, more distant. She stopped sleeping in the guest room and claimed one of the spare bedrooms on the opposite end of their mansion, as far from Brian as possible, while still living in the same house. Their conversations became transactional, about household matters, social obligations, nothing personal. Then, she started coming home late. The first time, she claimed dinner with friends had run long. The second time, a charity event. By the fifth time in 2 weeks, she stopped offering explanations at all. She'd breeze in after midnight, smelling of expensive wine and something else. Cologne that wasn't Brian's. Perfume that wasn't hers. Brian told himself he was imagining things. Stephanie was out socializing, networking, living her life. She had every right. Their marriage might be failing, but he couldn't expect her to become a hermit. But the late nights became overnights. She'd text that she was staying at her parents' estate or at a friend's flat in the city. When she did come home, she'd pick fights over nothing. The way he'd arranged the mail, the temperature of the house, the sound of his voice. Everything about him irritated her. One night, 6 months into their marriage, Brian broke. He hired a private investigator. It took only 3 days for the report to arrive, complete with photographs and timestamps. Stephanie had dinner with a man, not just any man, but someone younger, more attractive, laughing in a way she hadn't laughed with Brian in months. Stephanie entering a hotel with the same man. Stephanie leaving the next morning, wearing the same clothes. The evidence was irrefutable. Brian sat in his study. The photographs spread across his desk like accusations, and felt something inside him shatter completely. He'd failed as a husband in every possible way, and now his wife had found someone who could give her what he couldn't. He waited up for her that night. When she finally came home at 2 in the morning, he was in the living room, a glass of scotch in hand, the photographs on the coffee table. Stephanie saw them and froze. For a moment, guilt flickered across her face. Then it hardened into defiance. "So you had me followed," she said, her voice flat. "I needed to know. Now you know." She dropped her purse on a chair, kicked off her heels. "Are you happy?" "Happy?" Brian's laugh was bitter. "My wife is having an affair. Why would I be happy?" "What did you expect, Brian?" Stephanie's voice rose. "You can't touch me, can't give me children, can barely look at me without guilt written all over your face. Did you think I'd just accept a marriage with no intimacy at 29? "I've been trying," Brian said, his voice breaking. "I've seen every doctor, tried every treatment, and nothing works." She was shouting now. "Nothing changes. You're still broken, and I'm still trapped, and I met someone who makes me feel like a woman instead of a nurse caring for an invalid." The word invalid hit harder than any physical blow could have. "How long?" Brian asked quietly. 2 months. "Do you love him?" Stephanie hesitated, and in that hesitation, Brian saw the truth. "No," she said finally. "It's not like that. It's just physical. It's just intercourse, Brian. That's all." "Just intercourse," he repeated numbly. "Yes." She sat down across from him, suddenly exhausted. "I'm not leaving you for him. I'm not having some grand affair. I needed to feel desired, to feel normal. And they sat in silence. The wreckage of their marriage spread out between them like shrapnel. I want a divorce, Brian said finally. No. Stephanie's response was immediate. I don't want a divorce. How can you say that? You're sleeping with someone else. And you're impotent, she shot back. We both have situations to deal with. This is mine. He's discreet. We're careful. And it's just physical. No emotions, no complications. Stephanie, this is insane. Is it? She leaned forward. You can't make me feel like a woman. Fine. Someone else can. But you can give me everything else. Security, status, family name. Why should we blow up our lives over something we can manage? Manage? Brian felt like he was losing his mind. You want me to just accept this? Let you continue seeing him? Do you have a better solution? Her voice was cold, practical. Divorce would destroy both our reputations. The scandal alone would damage Kingston Enterprises and my father's company. Your investors would lose confidence. My family would be humiliated, all over something that could remain private. Brian stared at his wife, this woman he'd promised to love and honor, and barely recognized her. If you're going to do this, he said slowly, each word costing him no emotions. You said it yourself, it's just physical. The moment you develop feelings for him, we're done. Stephanie nodded. Agreed. And discretion. Complete discretion. If this gets out. It won't, she promised, but promises, Brian was learning, meant very little. The arrangement, if it could be called that, held for exactly 3 weeks. Then, Stephanie's late nights turned into weekend trips. Then, the weekend trips became week-long vacations. Her excuses grew thinner. Spa retreats with friends, charity work abroad, family obligations. Brian stopped asking. He focused on work, throwing himself into Kingston Enterprises with an intensity that worried even Ted. You're going to burn out, Ted warned over lunch one day. You've been working 16-hour days for months. I'm fine, Brian said automatically. You're not fine. None of this is fine. Ted lowered his voice. I know about Stephanie's situation. Brian's hand tightened around his water glass. Did she tell you? I figured it out. I'm not blind, mate. Neither is anyone else who knows her well. She's been seen around town with the same guy multiple times. As long as it stays rumors, that's the thing. Ted interrupted. It won't stay rumors. She's getting careless. Last week, they were at the Ivy. The week before, that gallery opening in Shoreditch. People are talking. Brian felt sick. She promised discretion. Then she's breaking that promise. Ted's expression was sympathetic. You need to end this, Brian, before it destroys you completely. But Brian couldn't seem to make himself do it. Some part of him still hoped that if he just worked hard enough, earned enough, proved himself valuable enough in other ways, Stephanie would come back to him, that they could salvage something from the wreckage. He was wrong. The breaking point came at the Pemberton Charity Gala, one of the biggest social events of the London season. Brian had planned to attend, but a crisis at the Singapore office required his immediate attention. An emergency video conference was scheduled for the exact time the gala was starting. Go without me, he told Stephanie that afternoon. Make excuses. Say I'm ill or something. Fine, she said, already scrolling through her phone. Brian was 3 hours into the video conference, negotiating a deal that could cost the company millions if it fell through, when his phone started buzzing. Text after text, calls from numbers he didn't recognize. Finally, he glanced at the screen during a brief break. The first message was from his mother. Please tell me these photos aren't real. With dread pooling in his stomach, Brian opened the link she'd sent. It led to a celebrity gossip site, and there, in full color, were photographs of Stephanie at the Pemberton Gala. But she wasn't alone, and she wasn't being subtle. She was on the arm of her lover, a man Brian now knew was named Marcus Bellamy, a fitness instructor and aspiring model. They were laughing, holding hands, and in one particularly damning photo, almost kissing. The caption read, "Kingston heir's wife steps out with mystery man, trouble in paradise." Brian's vision swam. She'd promised discretion. She'd promised it was just physical. But here she was, at one of the most photographed events of the year, publicly displaying her affair. He abandoned the video conference. His team would have to handle it. He drove home, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles went white, his mind a white noise of rage and betrayal. Stephanie wasn't home when he arrived. She rolled in at 3 in the morning, clearly buzzed from champagne, still wearing her gala dress. "What on earth were you thinking?" Brian exploded the moment she walked through the door. "Oh, you saw," she said with a careless shrug. "So what? So what? Stephanie, you were photographed almost kissing him, at a public event, with hundreds of people watching." "Maybe I'm tired of hiding," she shot back. "Tired of pretending our marriage is something it's not. You promised discretion, and you promised to be a real husband." Her voice matched his in volume now. "But here we are, both disappointed. This is going to be everywhere. The tabloids, social media, our families will be humiliated. The company's reputation." "Oh, please," Stephanie laughed bitterly. "The almighty company. That's all you care about, isn't it? Not that your wife is miserable. Not that our marriage is a joke. Not the company's reputation. That's not fair." "Fair?" Her eyes blazed. "Nothing about this is fair. I'm 29 years old, Brian. I should be having the best time of my life, planning for babies, enjoying my marriage. Instead, I'm trapped with a man who can't even touch me. I'm trying." "You're always trying," she screamed. "But it's never enough. You'll never be enough. And I'm done pretending that's okay." The silence after her outburst was deafening. "I want a divorce," Stephanie said, her voice suddenly calm, decided. "I'm filing tomorrow." "Stephanie, don't. It's over, Brian. It's been over. We've just been too proud or too stubborn to admit it." She walked past him, heading for the stairs. Brian felt rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened. "For what it's worth," Stephanie said from the staircase, not turning around, "I did love you once. Before all this, I really did." Then she was gone, leaving Brian alone in the foyer of their mansion, his marriage ending not with tears but with resignation. The next morning, the divorce papers arrived. Their marriage had lasted barely 11 months. Brian didn't want to sign. Some stubborn part of him held on to hope that Stephanie would change her mind, that they could find some way through this. For 2 weeks, the papers sat on his desk, untouched, while his lawyer called repeatedly urging him to respond. "She's not going to take them back," his lawyer said. "And the longer you wait, the worse the media coverage gets." Because the media had indeed gone insane. The photos from the gala had sparked a firestorm. Every tabloid in Britain was running stories about the Kingston marriage falling apart, about Stephanie's affair, about Brian's mysterious health issues that had been whispered about in society circles. Most of the coverage favored Brian, the faithful husband, betrayed by his cheating wife. Stephanie was called everything from a gold digger to a heartless adulteress. Her social media was flooded with hateful comments. Brian should have felt vindicated. Instead, he just felt empty. He signed the papers on a Tuesday afternoon, his hand shaking as he put pen to paper. With his signature, he dissolved their marriage, ended their partnership, admitted defeat. The media coverage intensified. Speculation ran wild about the terms of the settlement, about who would get what, about whether Brian would ever remarry. Brian stopped reading the articles, stopped watching the news, stopped answering calls from everyone except Ted and his immediate family. He thought the worst was over. He was wrong. 2 weeks after the divorce was finalized, Stephanie appeared on Britain Tonight, the country's most watched evening talk show. Brian was in his office when Ted burst in, his face pale. "Turn on the television," Ted said urgently. "Channel 4, now." Brian grabbed the remote, switching on the large screen on his office wall, and there was Stephanie, looking beautiful and vulnerable in a simple cream dress, sitting across from host Miranda Walsh. "Must have been so difficult for you," Miranda was saying, her voice dripping with sympathy. "It was," Stephanie said, her eyes glistening with practiced tears. "I went into my marriage with such hope, such love. I thought Brian and I would build a life together." Brian's stomach dropped. "What is she doing? Just watch," Ted said, grimly. "But things weren't as they seemed," Stephanie continued. "Brian had been in a car accident before our wedding. What I didn't know, what he didn't tell me, was that the accident had left him, unable to perform his husbandly duties." The studio audience gasped. Brian felt the blood drain from his face. "He's impotent," Stephanie said bluntly, and Brian heard his most private shame broadcast to millions of viewers. "And more than that, he's essentially infertile. He can't have children naturally. And he knew all of this before our wedding and didn't tell me." "That's a lie," Brian said to the screen. "I didn't know. He trapped me," Stephanie was saying, her voice breaking convincingly. "My father owns Patterson Industries, one of the largest manufacturing companies in Europe. Brian wanted a business connection, wanted access to my father's contacts and resources. So he married me, knowing he could never be a real husband, never give me children, because the business opportunity was worth more to him than my happiness." "This is insane," Brian breathed. "None of that is true." But Stephanie wasn't finished. "He was controlling too, monitoring my phone, having me followed by investigators, isolating me from my friends. When I finally found someone who treated me with kindness, who made me feel like a woman again, Brian tried to use it against me, to paint me as the villain when he was the one who'd lied from the beginning." Miranda Walsh made sympathetic noises. The audience murmured their support. And Brian watched his reputation, his privacy, his dignity being shredded on national television. "Why is she doing this?" Brian asked. "Saving face," Ted said quietly. "She was getting destroyed in the press for the affair. Now she's flipping the narrative. You're the villain, and she's the victim." "But none of it's true. I didn't know about my condition before the wedding. I didn't trap her for business connections." "Doesn't matter," Ted said. "People believe what they want to believe. And a beautiful woman claiming she was trapped by a cold, calculating businessman? That's a compelling story." The interview continued for another 20 minutes. Stephanie detailed Brian's controlling behavior, his obsession with work, his emotional manipulation. She cried. She laughed bitterly. She played the role of wounded innocent perfectly. When it finally ended, Brian sat in stunned silence. His phone was already ringing. His mother, his sister, his corporate communications team, everyone wanting a response, a statement, a defense. "What do I do?" Brian asked. "You fight back," Ted said immediately. "You go on record, tell your side." "No," Brian's voice was flat, decided. "I'm not doing that. Brian, you have to defend yourself." "And say what, Ted?" "That yes, I'm impotent and subfertile, but I really didn't know before the wedding? That'll just confirm all the details she shared and make me look pathetic. Or I deny everything and look like I'm lying? You can't just let her destroy you. She already has." Brian stood, walking to the window. Below, he could see photographers gathering outside the building. "It doesn't matter what I say. People will believe what they want, And right now, they want to believe her. Over the next few days, the media storm grew worse. Brian's silence was taken as admission of guilt. Editorial writers opined about powerful men who manipulated women. Social media exploded with hashtags. Brian's company's stock dipped. Business partners called for meetings. The board of directors demanded a response. Brian's life became a nightmare of pitying looks and whispered conversations. At the office, colleagues would stop talking when he entered rooms. At family gatherings, relatives treated him like fragile glass. Everywhere he went, people stared, pointed, whispered. The worst were the women, the ones who looked at him with pity, or worse, disgust, as if his condition made him less than a man, as if Stephanie's lies had revealed some fundamental weakness in him. He couldn't escape it. London, his home, had become a prison of judgment and speculation. "I need to leave," Brian told Ted one evening in his office. They were alone, the building empty, just two friends surrounded by the wreckage of Brian's life. "Leave?" Ted looked alarmed. "Leave the company? Leave London? Leave England? I need to disappear for a while. Go somewhere no one knows me, where I'm not that guy from the news." Ted was quiet for a moment. "Where would you go?" "I have that apartment in New York," Brian said. "The one I bought a few years ago as an investment. I've never even stayed there. No one knows about it except you and Jerry." "Your cousin Jerry?" Ted looked skeptical. "The one who can barely manage his own life? It's in his name. For tax purposes, no one would think to look for me there." Brian ran his hands through his hair. "I just need time, Ted. Time to figure out who I am outside of all this. Time to breathe without someone watching. For how long? I don't know. A few months? Maybe longer. You can handle things here. You've been practically running the place anyway while I've been distracted. What about your family? Tell them I'm in Asia, expanding operations or something. They'll believe you." Ted studied his friend's face. The exhaustion, the defeat, the desperate need to escape. Finally, he nodded. "Okay, but stay in touch. I need to know you're all right." "I will," Brian promised. "Just don't tell anyone where I really am. Not my family, not anyone. I need complete anonymity." 2 days later, Brian Kingston boarded a plane to New York, using a passport that listed him simply as B. Kingston. No mention of his title or company. He wore jeans and a hoodie, clothes he rarely touched, and kept his head down, avoiding eye contact. As the plane lifted off, carrying him away from the ruins of his marriage, his reputation, and his life, Brian stared out the window at London disappearing below. He was running away. He knew that. But sometimes, running was the only way to survive. In New York, no one would know him. No one would pity him, or judge him, or whisper about his failures. In New York, maybe he could figure out how to be Brian Kingston again, or maybe he'd discover he'd never really known who that was in the first place. The taxi pulled up outside a modest brownstone on the Upper West Side, and Brian Kingston felt something loosen in his chest for the first time in months. New York City hummed around him, car horns, distant sirens, the chatter of people passing by. But no one looked at him twice. No cameras, no whispers, no recognition. Just another man with a suitcase on a quiet street. He'd chosen this building specifically for its anonymity. No doorman to remember faces, no concierge to gossip. Just a simple security entrance with a keypad. The apartment had been purchased 3 years ago through his cousin Jerry's name, a tax shelter his accountant had suggested. Brian had never even seen it in person, had simply approved the purchase based on photographs and location. Now, standing outside, with jet lag pulling at his bones and exhaustion settling deep in his soul, it represented salvation. A place where Brian Kingston didn't exist, where his failures hadn't been broadcast on national television, where he could simply be. He punched in the entrance code, hefted his designer suitcase, one of the few luxuries he'd allowed himself to bring, and climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, apartment 7B. His hands shook slightly as he fitted the key in the lock. The door swung open smoothly, and Brian stepped inside, letting his suitcase drop. Then he froze. This wasn't right. The apartment in the photos had been empty, bare walls and hardwood floors. But this space was lived in. A colorful throw blanket draped over the couch, plants on the windowsill, framed artwork on the walls. A laptop sat open on the coffee table, papers scattered around it. The air smelled like coffee and something floral, distinctly feminine. Had Jerry rented it out? No, that was impossible. Jerry knew Brian might need it eventually, knew it was being kept available. Unless music drifted from the kitchen, something upbeat and poppy. Then he heard it, humming, off-key but enthusiastic, accompanied by the sizzle of something cooking. Brian's confusion quickly morphed into anger. Someone was in his apartment, his sanctuary, his escape, his one place where he was supposed to be safe, and someone had invaded it. He moved toward the kitchen, his shoes silent on the hardwood. As he rounded the corner, his breath caught. A woman stood at the stove, her back to him, swaying her hips to whatever was playing through her wireless earbuds. She wore tiny sleep shorts that showcased long, toned legs and an oversized white shirt that slipped off one shoulder. Her skin was a rich brown, glowing in the morning sunlight, streaming through the windows. Natural curls were piled high on her head in a messy bun, a few tendrils escaping to frame her face. She was beautiful, Brian registered distantly, and she was cooking in his kitchen like she owned the place. She turned, spatula in hand, singing along to her music. Then she saw him. The scream that followed could have shattered glass. "Who are you?" she shrieked, brandishing the spatula like a weapon. With her other hand, she yanked out her earbuds. "What are you doing in my apartment?" "Your apartment?" Brian's confusion and anger collided. "This is my apartment." "Like hell it is." She backed toward the counter, never lowering her makeshift weapon. Her eyes darted to her phone on the counter. "I've been living here for a month. I have a lease." "That's impossible. I own this apartment. I have the deed." But she was already grabbing her phone, fingers flying across the screen. "Yes, there's an intruder in apartment 7B, she said, her voice remarkably steady despite the fear in her eyes. "He's claiming he owns the place, but I have a lease. Please hurry." "Wait, I can explain," Ryan started, but she cut him off. "Stay back. I know self-defense." To prove her point, she shifted into what was probably meant to be a fighting stance, though it looked more like something from a YouTube video than actual training. Under different circumstances, Brian might have found it endearing. Right now, he was too busy being furious and bewildered. "I'm not going to hurt you. There's clearly been some mistake. The only mistake is you breaking into my apartment." She kept the phone to her ear, her other hand still gripping the spatula. "Yes, I'm still here. He's just standing there." "No, he hasn't tried anything yet. Please, how long until—" "Oh, thank God." Within minutes, Brian heard heavy footsteps on the stairs. 2 security guards burst through the door he'd left open, taking in the scene. Brian in his expensive clothes and designer shoes, the woman in tiny shorts clutching a spatula. "He just walked in," she said immediately. "Used a key somehow. Claimed the apartment was his." "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with us," one guard said, his hand moving to his belt where a radio was clipped. "This is absurd," Brian protested. "I own this apartment. Call Jerry Kingston. He's the name on the deed. He'll confirm." "Sir, we need you to come with us now, or we'll call the police." "Call them," the woman insisted. He could be dangerous. Brian's temper, already frayed from months of stress, finally snapped. I am not dangerous. I flew halfway around the world to get here. I'm exhausted, and I just want to understand why there's a stranger in my apartment." But the guards weren't interested in his explanations. One of them gripped Brian's arm. He actually grabbed him, like he was some common criminal, and began leading him toward the door. "This is a mistake," Brian said, his voice tight. "A huge mistake." The woman stood in her kitchen doorway, watching him go with a mixture of fear and suspicion. The last thing Brian saw before being led down the stairs was her reaching to turn off the stove, still holding that ridiculous spatula. The police station in the 20th precinct was nothing like Brian expected. It smelled like industrial cleaner and old coffee, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. He sat in a holding cell, an actual holding cell, like a criminal, his one phone call used to reach Jerry, who'd sounded panicked and promised to come immediately. "This cannot be happening," Brian muttered, dropping his head into his hands. He'd fled London to escape humiliation, only to be arrested in New York within an hour of arrival. If the media got wind of this, "Mr. Kingston?" Brian looked up to see a disheveled young man approaching the cell. Jerry Kingston was 26, with messy brown hair that looked like he'd just rolled out of bed and clothes that suggested he'd gotten dressed in the dark. He was Brian's cousin, the black sheep of the family, perpetually broke despite his trust fund, and apparently the source of Brian's current nightmare. "Jerry, please tell me you can explain why there's a woman living in my apartment." Jerry winced, running his hands through his already chaotic hair. "I can explain. It's not great, but I can explain." An officer unlocked the cell, and Brian was processed out with apologies once Jerry confirmed ownership and Brian's identity. They stood on the steps outside the station, early morning New York, bustling around them, and Jerry started talking fast. "I needed cash, quick cash. There was this investment opportunity, and it was time-sensitive, and I knew the apartment was just sitting empty. So you rented out my apartment." Brian's voice was dangerously calm. "I was going to tell you, but you were dealing with the divorce and the media thing, and I didn't want to bother you with minor details." "Minor details?" Brian's volume rose, causing several passers-by to glance over. He lowered his voice. "You rented out my safe house without telling me, and you consider that minor? When you put it that way, it sounds bad." "Because it is bad, Jerry. Look, I'm sorry, I really am, but she has a legitimate lease. I signed it, she paid first and last month's rent, everything legal and binding. I can't just kick her out." Brian stared at his cousin, torn between fury and exhaustion. "Who is she?" "Abigail Johnson. She's a writer, I think, working on a novel. She seemed really nice when I showed her the place." Jerry pulled out his phone, scrolling through messages. "She was desperate to find something affordable in a good neighborhood. I gave her a deal, below market rate. Honestly, because she needed it, and I needed the cash fast." "How much below market rate?" Jerry mumbled something. "What?" "About 40% below market rate," Jerry admitted, not meeting Brian's eyes. "You gave a stranger a 40% discount on my apartment? She's a struggling writer." I felt bad. Brian counted to 10 in his head, then 20. "Get her out. I can't just—" "I don't care what you have to do. Offer her money to break the lease. Double what she's paid. Triple it. I want her out." "Sorry to cut in, please forgive me. I don't usually do this anymore. But with the way things have been going recently, I'm forced to do this. This story might be a little bit long, but trust me, it took way longer to write this story, and I noticed that majority of this beautiful family sometimes listen to our stories, enjoy them, but yet forget to like and comment on our stories. Please, if you're enjoying this story, let us know where in the world you are tuning in from. I would love to draft a story featuring your corner of the world. And please, don't forget to like and share this story with a loved one. Thank you. Now, back to our story. They returned to the apartment building an hour later, Brian having retrieved his suitcase from where the security guards had left it. Jerry knocked on the door of 7B nervously, and after a long moment, it opened. Abigail Johnson had changed into jeans and a sweater, her curls now loose around her shoulders. She looked at Jerry with betrayal and at Brian with deep suspicion. "You," she said, pointing at Jerry. "You told me you owned this apartment." "Technically, I do," Jerry said weakly. "On paper, but it's actually Brian's. So you lied to me." "Not exactly lied, more like simplified the ownership structure." "Jerry," Brian interrupted. "Stop helping." He turned to Abigail, trying for diplomacy despite his exhaustion. "Miss Johnson, I apologize for the confusion this morning. There's clearly been a misunderstanding." The only misunderstanding is why you walked into my apartment without permission," she said coolly. "It's my apartment," Brian shot back. "I have a lease that says otherwise." She crossed her arms. "Legal, binding, signed by the property owner." She glared at Jerry. "Or who I thought was the property owner." "Look," Jerry jumped in. "We want to make this right. We're prepared to offer you compensation if you're willing to vacate." "No." The single word hung in the air. "I'm sorry?" Brian said. "I said no." Abigail's chin lifted stubbornly. "I searched for 3 months to find an apartment I could afford in a safe neighborhood. I signed a legal lease. I moved all my things here. I'm not leaving just because it's suddenly inconvenient for you." "I'll double what you've paid," Brian offered. "No." "Triple." "No." "Name your price." "There isn't one." Her eyes flashed. "I have rights as a tenant, Mr. Kingston. I'm not some problem you can throw money at until it goes away." Brian felt his temper rising again. "This is my apartment, that you rented to me." She turned to Jerry. "Did I or did I not sign a legal lease?" "You did," Jerry admitted miserably. "Is that lease valid?" "Technically, yes." "Then I'm not going anywhere." They argued for nearly an hour. Brian offered increasingly ridiculous sums of money. Abigail refused every single one, her stubbornness matching his own. Jerry tried to mediate and only made things worse. The building manager was called, reviewed the lease, and confirmed that yes, it was legal and binding. "This is insane," Brian finally said, exhaustion overwhelming anger. "I flew 8 hours to get here. I just want to sleep in my own apartment, and I just want to live in my apartment without strange men walking in." Abigail shot back. "I'm not a strange man. I'm the owner, who I've never met or heard about until today." They glared at each other across the living room, two stubborn people locked in an impossible situation. Jerry cleared his throat nervously. "I have an idea. A compromise." "No," Brian and Abigail said simultaneously, then glared at each other harder. "Just hear me out," Jerry pleaded. "The apartment has 2 bedrooms, right? What if you both shared?" The silence that followed was deafening. "Absolutely not," Brian said. "Out of the question," Abigail agreed. "Think about it," Jerry pressed. "Brian, fighting this in court could take months, and it'll attract the exact kind of attention you came here to avoid. And Abigail, finding another place at this price in this neighborhood would be impossible. You'd both have your own bedrooms, your own space." "I am not sharing my apartment with him," Abigail protested. "My apartment," Brian corrected. "See, this would never work." But Jerry had planted the seed. As much as Brian hated to admit it, his cousin was right about one thing. A legal battle would mean lawyers, court appearances, his name in public records. The British press would find him within days. His escape would become another scandal. And Abigail, for all her bravado, looked worried too. She bit her lower lip, glancing around the apartment like she was already mourning its loss. "It would be temporary," Jerry said quickly. "Brian, You know, I would have offered my place if it was convenient, but I have a lot of friends already crashing at my place. Please, just think about it, just until we can figure something else out. You'd barely see each other in a place this size. I'll take the master bedroom, Brian said immediately. Excuse me? Abigail's head snapped toward him. I'm already in the master bedroom. I've been here a month. You can take the guest room. The master bedroom has the best view of the city. Should have thought of that before letting your cousin rent out your apartment. They argued about bedrooms for another 20 minutes. Jerry tried to intervene several times and was shut down by both of them. Finally, exhausted and jet-lagged beyond reason, Brian gave in. Fine, you can have the master bedroom. For now. For the duration of the lease, Abigail corrected, which is 6 months, with an option to renew. Brian felt a headache forming behind his eyes. 6 months? That's what I signed. He looked at Jerry, who nodded miserably. 6 months. He'd have to share his sanctuary with a stubborn, beautiful stranger for 6 months, unless he could convince her to leave, which seemed increasingly unlikely given her determination. Fine, he said finally. 6 months. But we need ground rules. Agreed, Abigail said quickly. Starting with, don't ever walk into my bedroom without knocking. Don't walk into my bedroom at all, Brian countered. They spent the next hour establishing boundaries, kitchen schedules, bathroom protocols, noise restrictions. Jerry wrote everything down like he was documenting a peace treaty. By the time they finished, Brian was swaying on his feet from exhaustion. I'm going to the guest room, he announced. Don't disturb me. Wasn't planning on it, Abigail muttered. Brian grabbed his suitcase and found the guest room, smaller than the master, with a window facing the brick wall of the neighboring building instead of the city skyline. He could hear Abigail moving around in what should have been his bedroom, and the unfairness of it all crashed over him. He'd left London to escape. Instead, he'd landed in a different kind of nightmare, trapped in close quarters with a woman who clearly despised him, his privacy compromised, his sanctuary invaded. Brian collapsed onto the bed without even undressing. His last thought before sleep claimed him being that things literally could not get worse. He was, of course, wrong. The first week of their forced cohabitation was a cold war fought with passive-aggressive precision. Brian discovered that Abigail was not a morning person. She was, however, determined to make his morning routine as unpleasant as possible. When his alarm went off at 5 a.m. for his workout, she'd bang on the wall and shout, "Some people are trying to sleep." When he made his protein smoothie, which required a blender, which was admittedly loud, she'd emerge from her room in her pajamas, glaring at him with eyes that promised murder. "Do you have to do that at 5 in the morning?" she demanded on the third day. "I have a schedule," Brian replied coolly, not pausing in his blending. "You're welcome to use the kitchen after 7 a.m., as we agreed. You're deliberately being obnoxious. I'm making breakfast." Their arguments became routine. By the fourth morning, they'd stopped speaking entirely during Brian's kitchen time, communicating only through hostile glares. Abigail retaliated beautifully. She started practicing dramatic monologues at midnight, apparently research for her novel. She'd pace her room, her voice carrying through the walls, delivering what sounded like Shakespeare with theatrical intensity. "Can you keep it down?" Brian shouted through the wall on the second night. "I'm working," she shouted back. "You're welcome to use the apartment after 10 p.m., as we agreed." He buried his head under his pillow and tried to ignore the sound of "to be or not to be," delivered with excessive emotion. Their differences became glaringly obvious. Brian was meticulous to a fault. Everything in the common areas had its place, labeled and organized with precision that bordered on obsessive. Abigail was chaos personified. Within days, the living room coffee table disappeared under manuscript pages. Post-it notes were stuck randomly on every surface, and her coffee mugs multiplied like rabbits, abandoned half full in corners. "Do you actually live here? Or are you running a paper factory?" Brian asked one morning, gathering her notes from the kitchen counter where he needed to prep his breakfast. "Do you actually live here? Or is this a museum?" Abigail shot back, deliberately moving his perfectly aligned spice rack 2 inches to the left. Brian's eyes twitched. He moved it back to its proper position. She moved it again, maintaining eye contact the entire time, daring him to react. He didn't give her the satisfaction. He simply took his smoothie and retreated to his room, already planning his counterattack. They established territories through sheer stubbornness. Brian claimed the kitchen from 5 a.m. to 7 a.m. for his health-conscious breakfast routine. Abigail owned it from 7 p.m. onwards, filling the apartment with the aroma of her cooking, not that she ever offered him any, despite how amazing it smelled. One evening, Brian came home to find Abigail's friends sprawled across the living room. There were at least 6 people, all around laptops, pizza boxes everywhere, wine bottles on his coffee table, without coasters. "Writers' group," Abigail explained, with a sweet smile, when she noticed him standing in the doorway. "We meet every Wednesday." "Every Wednesday?" His eyes did that twitching thing again. "Oh, didn't Jerry tell you? It was in my lease agreement." It absolutely was not in the lease agreement. Brian retreated to his room and did the only thing that made him feel better. He scheduled his most important business calls for the following morning, right in the living room where Abigail would be trying to write. At 9 a.m. sharp, he emerged in his most expensive suit, armor for psychological warfare, set up his laptop on the dining table, and called the Berlin office. "Guten Morgen," he said loudly in German, pacing as he talked. "Ja, ich habe die Berichte überprüft." Abigail looked up from her writing spot on the couch, glaring daggers at him. He smiled pleasantly and continued his call, switching to French when the Paris office joined. "Do you mind?" she asked when he paused between calls. "Business calls," he replied, with the same sweet smile she'd given him. "Very important. I do own a company, after all." "What company?" Brian hesitated. He'd been careful not to reveal too much about himself. "Import, export," he said vaguely. "Very boring." She clearly didn't believe him, but she didn't press. She simply gathered her things and moved to her bedroom, slamming the door hard enough to make the walls shake. Round 2 to Brian. But Abigail wasn't done. She started a new habit that made Brian's organized soul scream. She'd leave her creative process everywhere. Post-it notes with story ideas stuck to his bathroom mirror. Character sketches left on the dining table. Coffee cups with lipstick stains abandoned on every available surface, each with a note about which chapter she'd been working on when drinking from it. "There are 5 half-empty cups in the living room alone," Brian said one evening, gathering them up. "How is this possible?" "I get distracted while writing," Abigail said unapologetically. "It's part of my creative process." "Your creative process is a health code violation. Your personality is a health code violation." They glared at each other across the kitchen. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Then Brian noticed something. Despite her creative chaos, Abigail had started making 2 cups of coffee in the morning, leaving one on the counter for him. She never acknowledged it, never mentioned it, but every morning at 7 a.m., there was a fresh cup waiting, made exactly how he liked it. And despite his obsessive organization, Brian had started being quieter with his morning routine. The blender was on a lower setting. He moved more carefully, less likely to wake her. They were adapting to each other, even as they tried their best not to. Then came the Thursday night that changed everything. Abigail had a date, one of many, Brian had noticed. She seemed to have a system, going out every Thursday and Saturday with different men. She'd mentioned once that she wanted to be married before turning 30, and at 29, she was treating dating like a job. Brian told himself he didn't care. He definitely didn't watch from his window as she left in a blue dress that hugged her curves perfectly. He absolutely didn't check the time when 9:30 p.m. rolled around and she wasn't home yet. At 10 p.m., his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is Abigail. My date stood me up. It's pouring rain. Can you pick me up? I'm at Lorenzo's on 7th. Brian stared at the message. Every rational part of his brain said to let her figure it out herself. Call a taxi, an Uber, ask one of her writer friends. They weren't friends. They barely tolerated each other. But he was already grabbing his keys. He found her huddled under the restaurant awning, her blue dress soaked despite her attempts to stay dry. She looked miserable and small, nothing like the fierce woman who'd confronted him with a spatula. She slid into his car without a word, and they drove in silence except for the rain hammering against the windows and the soft jazz playing on his stereo. At a red light, he glanced over. She was shivering. Without a word, he reached into the back seat and handed her his suit jacket. It was Armani. Probably cost more than her monthly rent, but that didn't matter. "Thanks," she muttered, wrapping it around her shoulders. Bad date? No date at all. He never showed. Brian felt an unexpected surge of anger toward this faceless man who'd left her waiting. His loss. She turned to look at him, surprise evident on her face. "Was that actually nice of you?" "Don't get used to it." But something had shifted. When they got home, Abigail disappeared into the kitchen and emerged with 2 cups of hot chocolate, setting one on his desk without comment before retreating to her room. The next morning, his jacket was hanging on his door, professionally dry cleaned. Brian made his smoothie at 5:30 a.m. instead of 5. The fragile peace lasted exactly 3 days. Brian was hurrying down the stairs, late for a video call with Tokyo, when his foot caught on something, his untied shoelace, he'd realize later. He tumbled down the last 5 steps, landing in a heap at the bottom. His ankle twisted at an unnatural angle. "Damn," he gasped, pain shooting up his leg. "Oh my God." Abigail appeared in the stairwell, taking the steps 2 at a time. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands hovering uncertainly. "Are you okay? Can you move? Should I call emergency?" "I'm fine," Brian insisted, trying to stand and failing miserably. Pain exploded through his ankle, and he hissed through clenched teeth. "You're not fine. You're being stubborn." She moved closer, gently touching his ankle. He inhaled sharply. "Yeah, that's what I thought. Wait here." "Where else would I go?" he muttered. But she was already rushing back upstairs. She returned with an ice pack and their first aid kit, crouching beside him with a competence that surprised him. Her touch was gentle as she examined his ankle, her fingers careful and sure. "You're good at this," he said, watching her work. "My little brother was an athlete. I got plenty of practice." She wrapped his ankle with practiced efficiency. "You need to stay off this for a few days. I have meetings. You have a sprained ankle." She looked up, hands on her hips. "Your mysterious business empire can survive without you for a few days." Before he could argue, she was helping him up, letting him lean on her as they made their way to the living room couch. Her hair smelled like lavender, and she was stronger than she looked. "I'll get you some painkillers," she said, settling him on the couch with surprising gentleness. "Try not to fall down any more stairs while I'm gone." That night, she brought him dinner, actually sharing her cooking for the first time. It was delicious, some kind of pasta with homemade sauce, but he didn't tell her that. He just ate while she worked on her laptop nearby, occasionally checking if he needed anything. He found himself watching her more than he watched his own work. The way she mouthed words as she wrote, how she absently twirled her hair when thinking, the slight smile that appeared when she wrote something she liked. "Stop staring," she said without looking up. I know you're plotting revenge for making you rest. He wasn't. That was the problem. Over the following days, their dynamic shifted again. The Cold War melted into something that almost resembled friendship. They still bickered, but the edge was gone, replaced by something that felt dangerously like playfulness. Brian noticed everything about her now. How she danced while cooking, completely lost in her own world. The way she'd pace the balcony when stuck on a plot point, talking to herself. Her habit of leaving half-finished cups of tea everywhere, each marking a different chapter in her work. One Saturday morning, he found her asleep on the couch, manuscript pages scattered around her, reading glasses askew on her face. Without thinking, he draped a blanket over her. She stirred slightly, mumbling something about plot holes, and Brian felt his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. He was in trouble, deep trouble, because somewhere between the passive-aggressive warfare and the reluctant kindness, between the shouting matches and the silent gestures, Brian Kingston had started falling for his roommate, and he had absolutely no idea what to do about it. The Tuesday afternoon sun streamed through the apartment windows, painting everything in shades of gold. Brian had just returned from a grueling video conference with the London office. Managing Kingston Enterprises from across the Atlantic was challenging but necessary. His ankle had healed completely, and he'd fallen into a rhythm with Abigail that was surprisingly comfortable. Too comfortable, maybe. That was the problem. He'd started noticing things he shouldn't notice. The way her laugh sounded different depending on whether she was amused or truly delighted. How she bit her lower lip when concentrating on a difficult passage. The fact that she sang off-key in the shower every morning, the same 3 songs on rotation. The way his heart rate picked up whenever she walked into a room. Brian had convinced himself it was just proximity, just loneliness, just the natural result of sharing space with an attractive woman after months of isolation. Nothing more. He was lying to himself. That afternoon, he'd been reviewing quarterly reports, his mind half on spreadsheets and half on the fact that Abigail had been unusually quiet all day, holed up in her room writing. He needed a shower to wash away the stress of the London call, to clear his head before tackling the next crisis. They'd established a bathroom schedule early on, one of the many rules designed to maintain distance and boundaries, but lately, they'd both gotten lax about it. The schedule had become more of a suggestion than a rule. Trust replacing rigid structure. Brian grabbed his towel and headed for the main bathroom, the one between their bedrooms. He noticed the door was slightly ajar but didn't hear the shower running. In his distraction, thinking about profit margins and market projections, he pushed the door open, and time stopped. Abigail stood in the middle of the bathroom, having just stepped out of the shower. She was wrapped in a towel, a small towel that barely covered the essentials, water droplets trailing down her brown skin like liquid diamonds. Her natural curls were wet and sleek against her shoulders, her face free of makeup, glowing from the steam. Condensation clung to the mirror behind her, creating a hazy, dreamlike backdrop. Their eyes met in the mirror's reflection. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Brian's brain had completely short-circuited. Every thought fled except one overwhelming awareness. She was beautiful. Not just attractive or pretty, but devastatingly, breathtakingly beautiful. The curve of her neck, the slope of her shoulders, the way water beaded on her collarbones, everything about her made his chest constrict and his breath catch. And then he felt it. For the first time in over a year, his body responded. Not tentatively, not questionably, but immediately and undeniably. The sensation was so unexpected, so shocking, after months of nothing, that Brian actually gasped. "Oh God, I'm sorry." He stumbled backward, slamming the door shut with more force than necessary. His heart was hammering against his ribs, his hands shaking. "I didn't know you were." I'll come back later." "You could try knocking," Abigail yelled through the door, but he was already retreating to his room, his mind reeling. He closed his bedroom door, leaned against it, and tried to catch his breath. His whole body was trembling, not from fear or embarrassment, though he felt plenty of both, but from the sheer shock of arousal after so many months of numbness. It was happening. His body was working again, because of her, because of Abigail. The realization hit him like lightning, illuminating everything he'd been too afraid or too stubborn to see. It wasn't random. It wasn't spontaneous healing. It was specific. It was her. Brian sank onto his bed, his head in his hands, trying to process what this meant. All those doctors, all those tests, all those specialists who'd told him it was psychological, maybe they'd been right in a way. Maybe his body had been waiting for something, someone, or maybe he was reading too much into one physiological response. He grabbed his phone with shaking hands and pulled up Ted's number. In London, it would be late evening. Ted answered on the third ring, his voice warm with surprise. "Brian, everything all right? You don't usually call this late, your time." "Ted, Brian paused, unsure how to even begin. "I think it's happening again. There was a beat of silence. Then Ted's voice came back, alert and focused. "What? How? When?" "Just now, there was a situation. And I responded. For the first time since before the wedding, He broke off, running his free hand through his hair. "I don't know what to do." "Okay, slow down. Tell me exactly what happened," Brian explained, leaving out some of the more specific details but conveying the essential facts. He'd seen Abigail in a state of undress. His body had responded, and he was now having a minor crisis in his bedroom. "And you're sure?" Ted asked. "I mean, completely sure?" "Trust me, I'm sure." He could hear Ted thinking, the familiar sound of his friend pacing. "Right. Okay. This is good news, Brian. But we need to be certain. It could have been a one-time thing. You need to test it. Test it how? Like we did before. See if you respond to other women. If you do, then we know your condition is genuinely improving. If you don't, then it's specific to her. And that's a different situation entirely." Brian felt his stomach twist. "I can't do that strip club thing again. Not here. If anyone recognized me, not a strip club. Something more discreet. Give me a few days to arrange something. There are private clubs in New York, very exclusive, very confidential. We'll test it properly." "And if it's just her?" Brian asked quietly. "If I only respond to Abigail?" Ted was silent for a long moment. "Then you'll have to decide what you want to do about that. But first, let's confirm what we're dealing with." After they hung up, Brian lay back on his bed, staring at the ceiling. Through the walls, he could hear Abigail moving around in her room, and just the sound of her presence made his pulse quicken. He was terrified, not of his condition anymore, but of what this might mean. Because if his body only responded to Abigail, it meant something he wasn't ready to acknowledge, something that could complicate everything. It meant his body had known the truth before his mind was willing to admit it. He was falling in love with her. 5 days later, Ted had arranged everything with his characteristic efficiency. A private club in Manhattan, exclusive and discreet, where wealthy men came for entertainment that never made the tabloids. Brian had protested, had tried to back out 3 separate times. But Ted had been insistent. "You need to know," Ted had said firmly. "If it's specific to her, that changes everything. But you can't make decisions based on one incident." So Brian found himself in a luxurious townhouse in the East Village, sitting in a private room that looked more like a high-end hotel suite than anything seedy. The woman who greeted him was elegant and professional, explaining that several companions would spend time with him, each with different approaches, and everything would be completely confidential. "Take all the time you need," she said with a knowing smile. "There's no pressure, no expectations. This is a judgment-free space." The first woman who entered was stunning. Tall, blonde, with the kind of figure that graced magazine covers. She was charming and skilled, her touches practiced and confident. She tried everything: conversation, flirtation, physical contact. She was beautiful, objectively attractive in every possible way. Brian felt nothing. The second woman was different, exotic, with dark eyes and a sultry voice. She took a more direct approach, making her intentions clear, touching him with expert precision. Nothing. They brought in a third, a fourth, a fifth. Different types, different approaches, different everything. Some were chatty and fun. Others were quiet and mysterious. Some were aggressive. Others were gentle. Not a single one elicited even the slightest response from him. After 2 hours, Brian called it off. He thanked everyone profusely, paid far more than the agreed amount, and left feeling both relieved and devastated. The test had confirmed what he already knew but had been afraid to admit. His body only responded to Abigail. That night, alone in his room while Abigail was out at her writers' group, Brian lay in bed thinking about her. Not intentionally, not trying to test anything, just letting his mind wander to the sound of her laugh, the way she scrunched her nose when concentrating, how passionate she got when talking about her writing. His body responded immediately. The confirmation was both exhilarating and terrifying. After over a year of feeling broken, of believing something fundamental was wrong with him, his body was working perfectly, but only for her, only for the woman sleeping in the next room, the woman who barely tolerated him half the time, the woman he'd accidentally walked in on, and who still glared at him whenever she remembered it. Brian realized with stunning clarity what had happened. His previous doctors had been partially right. It was psychological, but not in the way they'd thought. His body hadn't shut down from stress or trauma. It had been waiting for something real, something genuine, something that mattered. It had been waiting for her. His impotence hadn't been a malfunction. It had been protection. His body refusing to pretend, refusing to go through the motions with someone who wasn't right. And Stephanie, for all that he'd thought he loved her, had never been right. But Abigail made him feel alive in ways he'd forgotten were possible. He was completely, utterly terrified. The next morning, Brian made a decision. If his body was telling him something, he needed to listen. But he also needed to be careful. Abigail had her own life, her own plans, her own dating schedule designed to find a husband before 30. He couldn't just blurt out that he'd developed feelings for her. He needed to spend more time with her, really get to know her, see if there was any possibility she might feel the same way. So he started looking for excuses. "I've been here well over 3 months and barely seen the city," he mentioned casually one morning over coffee. "You know any good places? I mean, you're the local." Abigail looked at him suspiciously over her mug. "You want me to give you a tour?" "Not a tour exactly. Just recommendations. Places worth seeing." He tried to sound casual, disinterested. "Unless you're too busy writing. I could use a break," she admitted. "My protagonist is being difficult today. She won't do what I need her to do." "Stubborn protagonist?" Brian smiled. "I can't imagine where you'd find inspiration for that." She threw a balled-up napkin at him, but she was smiling too. Their first not date, as Brian thought of it, was to a food truck festival in Brooklyn. Abigail insisted he try everything, delighting in his reactions to American street food that was nothing like the refined cuisine he was used to. "You got hot sauce on your shirt," she laughed, pointing at the stain on his expensive button-down. "Your designer shirt." "It's just a shirt," Brian said, but he found himself laughing too. When was the last time he'd laughed like this? Freely, genuinely, without the weight of expectations. She snorted, actually snorted while laughing, and immediately covered her mouth, embarrassed. Brian decided it was the most charming thing he'd ever witnessed. More not dates followed. Art galleries where she explained pieces with such passion that Brian found himself interested in modern art for the first time in his life. Jazz clubs, where she educated him on actual music, not that stuffy classical stuff you play. A tiny bookshop in the village where she spent an hour talking to the owner about obscure authors while Brian watched. Captivated by her enthusiasm, she was showing him her New York, not the elite, wealthy version he knew, but the real city, messy and vibrant and alive. And Brian found himself falling harder with every shared experience. But there was one problem. Abigail was still dating, every Thursday and Saturday, like clockwork. She had a system, apps, setups from friends, blind dates. She was determined to find a husband before her 30th birthday. She talked about it openly, treating dating like a project she needed to complete. Each date felt like a knife twisting in Brian's chest. He'd watch her get ready, putting on makeup and choosing outfits, and feel jealousy he had no right to feel. She'd leave with a cheerful wave, off to meet some stranger who didn't deserve her, and Brian would sit in the apartment trying to work and failing miserably. One Thursday evening, he heard them come back early. Abigail and her date, some lawyer named Marcus, or Matthew, or something generic. Brian was in his room, trying to focus on a contract review, when he heard voices in the living room. They were laughing. Then the laughter got quieter, more intimate. Brian's stomach clenched. He tried to ignore it, tried to focus on his work, but then he heard it, the unmistakable sound of kissing. His body moved before his brain caught up. He walked out of his room, deliberately loud, and headed straight for the kitchen. "Oh, sorry," he said. "Not sorry at all," flipping on every light in the open-plan space. "Just getting some water. Don't mind me." He took his time, filling a glass slowly, drinking it even slower, very aware of the two people on the couch frozen in awkward silence. Abigail's lipstick was smudged, the man's shirt slightly askew. Brian felt a savage satisfaction at interrupting. "Want some water?" He offered the date with false politeness. "It's imported, very expensive. I'm particular about my water." "No, I should actually get going," the man said, standing abruptly. He gave Abigail an apologetic look. "Early meeting tomorrow. I'll call you?" "Sure," Abigail said tightly, her eyes shooting daggers at Brian. The moment the door closed behind her date, she rounded on him. "You did that on purpose." "Did what? Get water in my own apartment?" Brian's voice was innocence itself. "You scared him off. If he's scared off by a roommate getting water, he's not worth your time." Brian rinsed his glass with deliberate slowness. "Weak character, poor judgment. You can do better. You don't get to decide who I date. I'm not deciding anything. I'm just stating facts." They glared at each other across the kitchen island, tension crackling between them. Abigail opened her mouth to say something else, then apparently thought better of it, and stormed off to her room. Brian stood alone in the bright kitchen, guilt warring with satisfaction. He was being a jerk, and he knew it. But the thought of her with someone else, touching her, kissing her, taking her away from him, was unbearable. He had no right to feel this way, no claim on her. But logic had stopped mattering somewhere around the third non-date. The confrontation the next morning was inevitable. "What is your problem?" Abigail demanded, cornering him in the kitchen during his morning smoothie routine. "I don't know what you're talking about. Last night, you deliberately interrupted my date. I was thirsty. You have a mini fridge in your room, with water. I've seen it." Brian said nothing, focusing intently on measuring protein powder. "This is my home too," Abigail continued, her voice rising. I have a right to have people over without you playing weird territorial roommate." "You're right," Brian said finally, setting down the protein powder. "I apologize. It won't happen again." She blinked, clearly not expecting capitulation. Oh, well, good, but they both knew he was lying. And the next Thursday, when she went out with someone new, Brian found himself checking his watch every 5 minutes, waiting for her to come home, hoping this one would be terrible too. 2 weeks later, history repeated itself. Another Thursday, another date that stood her up. Brian's phone buzzed with her text. "Stood up again. Lorenzo's on 7th. Raining. Please?" He didn't even text back. He was already in his car. This time, when she got in, soaked and miserable in a red dress, he didn't take her straight home. He drove them to a small jazz club they'd visited before, a place that had become somehow theirs. "What are you doing?" she asked as he pulled up outside. "No one should waste a good dress. Come on, you can tell me more about my terrible music taste." Inside the club, dim lighting and soft jazz created a cocoon of intimacy. They found a corner booth, ordered drinks and small plates, and for once just talked without the usual barriers. "Why do you keep doing this?" Abigail asked, after her second glass of wine, gesturing between them. "Being nice to me when I get stood up? Maybe I'm not a complete jerk," Brian offered, "but you are a little bit of a jerk. Like a solid 30% jerk. I prefer to think of it as assertive." She laughed, and Brian felt his chest warm. "Why are you still single?" she asked, her whine making her bold. "I mean, you're..." She gestured vaguely at him. "You know what you are." "What am I?" He couldn't help teasing. "You know," she said, blushing slightly. "Handsome, successful, rich, apparently, based on your weird import-export business that you never fully explain. So why the lone wolf thing?" Brian stared at his drink, deciding how much truth to tell. "I was married," he said finally. "It didn't work out." "What happened?" "I couldn't." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I couldn't give her what she wanted." "Children?" Abigail asked gently. He nodded, letting her believe that was the whole truth. It was easier than explaining the complete disaster his marriage had been. She wanted a family. I couldn't provide that. Eventually, she found someone who could. "I'm sorry," Abigail said, and she sounded like she meant it. "That must have been hard." "It was, still is, sometimes." He looked up at her. "What about you? Why the desperate search for a husband before 30? "It's not desperate," she protested, but weakly. I made a promise to myself. Find love, get married, start a family, all before 30. I have a couple months left, but I'm nowhere close. Hence the dating marathon. That's a lot of pressure to put on yourself." "Maybe," she admitted, "but I watched my parents have this amazing love story, and I want that. I want the romance, and the partnership, and the family. I don't want to wake up at 40 and realize I missed my chance." "You won't," Brian said softly. "Someone would have to be insane not to fall in love with you." The words hung between them, heavier than he'd intended. Abigail stared at him, her eyes wide, something shifting in her expression. The jazz played softly in the background. The moment stretched, taut and fragile. Brian could kiss her right now. He could lean across the table, close the distance, and kiss her. Every instinct in his body was screaming at him to do it. Instead, he raised his hand and flagged down the waiter. "Another round?" he asked, his voice rough. The moment shattered. Abigail blinked and looked away, and Brian hated himself for being scared. They finished their drinks and talked about safer things, her novel, his work, the city, but the almost kiss hung over them like a ghost, acknowledged by neither but felt by both. On the drive home, rain streaking the windows, Brian's hand rested on the gear shift. Abigail's hand was on the seat beside him, close enough to touch. He could just move his hand a few inches, could take hers, could finally admit what he was feeling. He kept both hands on the wheel. At home, they said goodnight in the hallway between their rooms. Abigail lingered, looking like she wanted to say something. Brian waited, hoping. "Thanks for tonight," she said finally. "For rescuing me. Again. Any time," Brian said, meaning it more than she knew. She went into her room. Brian stood in the hallway for a long moment before retreating to his own. He was in love with her. Completely, irrevocably in love with her. His body had known it first, responding to her in ways it hadn't responded to anyone in over a year. But now his heart had caught up, and the feeling was overwhelming. He was terrified of losing her, terrified of telling her, terrified of this feeling that was bigger than anything he'd ever experienced. But more than anything, he was terrified that she might never feel the same way. Through the wall, he heard her moving around, getting ready for bed. He pressed his hand against the wall that separated them, feeling both impossibly close and impossibly far from the woman he loved. Tomorrow, he told himself, tomorrow he'd be braver. Tomorrow he'd find the courage to risk everything. But tonight, he lay in the dark, listening to her breathe on the other side of the wall, and tried to convince himself that cowardice was actually caution. He was failing. The days following their almost kiss at the jazz club felt different. The air in the apartment shifted, becoming charged with something Brian couldn't quite name but felt in every breath. It was as if they'd crossed an invisible line that night, and neither of them could pretend they hadn't. Abigail stopped going on dates. Brian noticed immediately. Thursday came and went. No date. Saturday arrived and passed. Still no date. She spent her evenings at home, working on her manuscript in the living room instead of hiding in her bedroom. Brian found excuses to join her, bringing his laptop to work beside her. Both of them in comfortable silence, broken only by the clicking of keyboards and occasional comments about their respective work. "Your protagonist finally cooperating?" he asked one evening, noticing her smile as she typed. "She's being less stubborn," Abigail replied, glancing at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Turns out she just needed to stop fighting what she actually wanted. The words felt loaded with meaning neither of them was ready to acknowledge directly. Their evenings developed a new rhythm. They'd cook together. Or rather, Abigail would cook while Brian attempted to help and mostly just got in the way. They'd watch old movies, arguing good-naturedly about plot points and character motivations. They'd discuss books, with Abigail lending him novels she loved, and Brian introducing her to the classics he'd studied at Oxford. "You're such a snob," she teased one night when he tried to explain the brilliance of Proust. "I prefer We're Fined," he countered, stealing a piece of popcorn from her bowl. "Snob," she repeated, but she was smiling, and her eyes were soft in the lamplight. One particularly warm October evening, they found themselves on the balcony with a bottle of wine, the city lights twinkling below them like earthbound stars. Abigail was telling him about her novel, really telling him, sharing the deep themes and emotional arcs she usually kept private. "So the main character thinks she has her whole life planned," she explained, gesturing with her wine glass. "She has this checklist, right? Career, romance, marriage, family. Very structured, very controlled. Sounds familiar," Brian murmured, watching her face as she talked. She was beautiful like this, passionate and animated, her whole being lit up from within. But then she meets this guy who completely throws her off balance. He's wrong for all her plans, doesn't fit her timeline, challenges everything she thought she wanted. And she's terrified because falling for him means letting go of control, means admitting her carefully constructed plan might not be what she actually needs. "What does she do?" Brian asked. though he suspected they weren't just talking about her novel anymore. "I don't know yet," Abigail admitted, taking a sip of wine. "I'm still figuring out if she's brave enough to take the risk." Their eyes met across the small balcony table. The autumn breeze stirred her curls, and Brian's fingers itched to brush them back from her face. "Stop it," Abigail said softly. "Stop what? Looking at me like that. Like what?" "Like you want to kiss me." The words hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable and terrifying. Brian's heart hammered against his ribs. This was it, the moment where he could either be honest or retreat back into safety. "Maybe I do," he said quietly. Abigail set down her wine glass with a soft click. "Then, why haven't you?" It was the same question she'd almost asked that night at the jazz club, the same tension that had been building between them for weeks. Brian's mind raced through all his reasons, his condition, his fear of disappointing her, the possibility that this might not be real, that he might hurt her the way he'd hurt Stephanie. But before he could voice any of those fears, Abigail spoke again. "I've been thinking about you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "During all those dates, every Thursday and Saturday, I'd be sitting across from some perfectly nice guy, and all I could think about was you. The way you make your terrible smoothies at dawn. How you organize the spice rack by cuisine type, which is insane. The fact that you pretend not to care when I leave my manuscript pages everywhere, but I've seen you carefully move them so they don't get damaged. Abigail. I stopped dating because I finally admitted something to myself," she continued, standing up and moving closer to him. "I was looking for someone to fit my plan, but you destroyed my plan. You made me realize that maybe what I actually want isn't a checklist husband who arrives on schedule. Maybe what I want is someone who drives me crazy and makes me laugh and picks me up in the rain without being asked." She was standing in front of him now, close enough that he could smell her lavender shampoo, could see the way her pulse fluttered in her throat. "Maybe what I want is you," she whispered. Then, slowly, she kissed him. For a heartbeat, Brian was too stunned to respond. Then every barrier he'd built came crashing down, and he was kissing her back with a desperation that surprised them both. His hands came up to frame her face, tilting her head to deepen the kiss. She tasted like wine and something sweet, something uniquely her, and Brian felt like he was drowning and being saved simultaneously. Abigail's fingers tangled in his hair, pulling him closer. The kiss went from tentative to urgent, from question to answer. When they finally broke apart for air, her lips were swollen, her eyes dark with desire. Inside, she breathed. Now, they stumbled through the balcony door, hands never leaving each other, mouths meeting again and again, like they were making up for lost time. They made it as far as the couch before Brian pulled her onto his lap, her legs straddling him, her body pressed against his in a way that made his mind go blank. His hands slid under her shirt, feeling the warmth of her skin, the curve of her waist. She gasped against his mouth, arching into his touch. Every nerve ending in Brian's body was alive, responsive, working perfectly for the first time in over a year. Then reality crashed back in. "Wait," Brian gasped, pulling back even though it physically hurt to do so. "Wait, we should..." "Should what?" Abigail's voice was breathless, her eyes glazed with desire. "We should take this slow." The words cost him everything, especially with her body pressed against his, her lips kiss-swollen, her hands still tangled in his hair. "Slow?" She looked confused, hurt even. "Brian, I just told you I want you. I kissed you. What part of this says slow?" "The part where this matters," he said, his hands still on her waist, unable to completely let go. "You matter. This, us, it matters. And I don't want to rush it and risk messing it up." Abigail studied his face, and he could see her trying to understand. trying to read what he wasn't saying. Slowly, she climbed off his lap, and Brian immediately missed her warmth. "Is this about your ex-wife?" she asked gently. "About what happened with her?" "Partially," Brian admitted. "It was true, even if it wasn't the whole truth. I rushed into marriage before, convinced it was right, and I don't want to make the same mistake with you. I want to do this properly." She was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay, slow. We can do slow." But the way she said it, the heat still in her eyes, suggested slow was going to be torture for both of them. They spent the rest of the evening trading soft kisses and softer words, learning the geography of each other's bodies with gentle touches that promised more but never quite delivered. When they finally said goodnight, standing in the hallway between their bedrooms, Abigail traced his jawline with her fingertips. "Good night, Brian," she whispered. "Good night, Abigail." He watched her disappear into her room, then went into his own, closing the door and leaning against it. His body was still humming with desire, still very much responsive, very much wanting her. But fear remained, coiled around his heart. What if he couldn't follow through? What if his body failed him at the crucial moment? What if he disappointed her the way he disappointed Stephanie? The thought kept him awake long into the night, wanting her desperately, but terrified of the wanting. Over the following weeks, their relationship bloomed in the privacy of their apartment. They kept it quiet, telling no one. Not Brian's family back in London, not Abigail's writer friends, not even Ted, though Brian suspected his friend had guessed something had shifted. Every morning, Brian would find Abigail in the kitchen, and they'd share coffee and stolen kisses before starting their respective work. Every evening, they'd cook together, their movements synchronized like a dance they'd been practicing for years. At night, they'd curl up on the couch, Abigail's head on Brian's shoulder, watching movies or reading or sometimes just talking until the early hours. Brian learned things about her he'd never known. That she'd grown up in Brooklyn with parents who'd been high school sweethearts. That her little brother was in medical school, the same brother whose athletic injuries had taught her first aid. That she'd started writing because her grandmother used to tell her stories, weaving magic out of words, and Abigail wanted to do the same. "She died when I was 16, Abigail said one night, her voice soft with memory. "Right before she passed, she made me promise to finish a story, any story, to see it all the way through. That's why this novel matters so much. I just need to complete it." "You will complete it," Brian said with certainty. "Your protagonist is going to figure out how to be brave." "I know she will." Abigail looked up at him, her eyes shining. "You think so?" "I know so." He kissed her forehead. She learned from the best. They navigated their new relationship carefully. Kisses that started innocently would heat up, hands would wander, breathing would quicken, and then Brian would pull back, his body screaming at him even as his mind counseled caution. "You're going to kill me with this slow thing," Abigail groaned one evening after a particularly heated makeout session ended with Brian retreating to his room. "I'm killing myself too," he muttered, but he couldn't risk it. Not yet. Not until he was absolutely certain his body wouldn't betray him, wouldn't disappoint her. October gave way to November, the city transitioning into autumn proper. One crisp Saturday afternoon, they decided to walk through Central Park. The trees were ablaze with color, reds and golds and oranges, painting the landscape like something from a storybook. Abigail was telling him about a breakthrough she'd had with her novel, gesturing animatedly with her coffee cup, leaves crunching under their feet. Brian was watching her face, lit up with excitement, thinking about how much he loved this woman, how she'd somehow healed parts of him he didn't know were broken. "And then I realized," she was saying, "the protagonist doesn't need to give up her dreams. She just needs to She broke off, laughing at something Brian had said, and he grinned back at her, feeling lighter than he had in years. Neither of them noticed the person with the phone, capturing their moment on video. The video went viral within hours. Brian didn't know about it until the next morning when his phone started buzzing incessantly. Texts from Ted, from his mother, from his sister, from board members at Kingston Enterprises, all asking the same question. Was that really him in New York? With dread pooling in his stomach, Brian opened the link Ted had sent. The video was short, maybe 15 seconds, showing him and Abigail walking through Central Park, laughing together. His profile was visible enough to be recognizable, and someone had clearly made the connection. The caption read, "Kingston heir spotted in NYC, reclusive billionaire's secret life in America." Within hours, it had been picked up by British tabloids, American gossip sites, financial news outlets. Everyone wanted to know where Brian Kingston had been hiding for the past months, who the woman was, what he was doing in New York. "How did they even recognize you?" Abigail asked, staring at the video on his phone with growing alarm. "My face was all over British media during the divorce," Brian said grimly, already scrolling through headlines. "Someone recognized me and started digging. It's only a matter of time before they find this address." And find it, they did. By evening, there were photographers outside their building. By the next morning, Brian's phone was ringing constantly with requests for interviews, statements, confirmations. The sanctuary he'd built was crumbling around him. Abigail found him in his bedroom 2 days later, packing a suitcase with methodical precision. "You're leaving," she said flatly from the doorway. Brian didn't turn around. "I have to. The media will descend on this place. They'll make your life hell. I can't do that to you. So you're just going to run away again? I'm protecting you. By abandoning me?" Her voice rose. "I saw the articles, Brian. All of them. I know about your condition, about the impotency and the infertility, about what your ex-wife said on television." Brian's hands stilled on the shirt he was folding. Slowly, he turned to face her. "You read all that?" "Of course I did. The whole internet is talking about you." She stepped into the room, her expression fierce. "Is it true, what she said about you?" "Some of it." Brian's voice was rough. "The condition is real. The impotency, the low sperm quality, that's all true. The part about me knowing before the wedding and trapping her, that's a lie. But the rest." He ran his hand through his hair. "That's why I wanted to go slow with us. Why I kept pulling back. I was terrified of disappointing you the way I disappointed her. And you think running away will solve this? I don't know what else to do." The words burst out of him, months of fear and frustration erupting. "I'm in love with you, Abigail. Completely, desperately in love with you. But I'm also broken in ways I can't fix, and you deserve someone who can give you everything you want." "Stop," Abigail interrupted, crossing the room to stand directly in front of him. "Stop deciding what I deserve. Stop trying to protect me from yourself. I'm a grown woman, Brian. I can make my own choices. But my condition, I don't care about your condition," she said fiercely. "I care about you, the man who picks me up in the rain, who organizes spices obsessively and makes terrible smoothies, who listens to me talk about my novel for hours without getting bored, who looks at me like I'm the most important person in his world." Tears were streaming down her face now, and Brian reached up to brush them away, his hand trembling. "I love you," Abigail said, her voice breaking. "All of you. Your condition doesn't change that. Nothing changes that. So stay. Stay with me. Stop running and just stay." Brian stared at her, this incredible woman who somehow loved him despite everything, and felt something break open in his chest. All the fear, all the shame, all the self-protection he'd built up over the past year came crashing down. "I love you too," he whispered. "God, I love you so much. She kissed him then, and it was different from all their other kisses. There was urgency in it, yes, but also certainty. A claiming, a promise, a refusal to let fear win. Brian kissed her back with everything he had, pouring all his love and desperation and hope into that kiss. His hands slid into her hair, tilting her head back, deepening the kiss until they were both breathless. "Don't stop," Abigail gasped against his mouth. "Please don't stop this time." "Are you sure?" Brian pulled back just enough to search her face. "Because once we—" "I'm sure." Her eyes were dark with desire and love and absolute certainty. "I've never been more sure of anything." Something shifted in that moment. Brian let go of his fear, let go of his past failures, let go of everything except the woman in his arms. When he kissed her again, it was with an intensity that made her gasp. His hands found the hem of her shirt, and she raised her arms to let him pull it off. They moved to the bed, clothes disappearing in a trail across the floor. Brian mapped every inch of her body with his hands and mouth, learning what made her sigh, what made her arch against him, what made her cry out his name, and his body responded, perfectly, completely, without hesitation or doubt. "I can feel something," he whispered against her skin, half laughing with relief and joy. "God, Abigail, I can feel everything." "Then don't stop," she repeated, pulling him closer. "Don't ever stop." They made love with an intensity that surprised them both, their bodies moving together like they'd done this 1,000 times before. Brian had never felt so connected to another person, so completely present and alive. Every touch was electric. Every kiss was a revelation. Every moment was perfect. Later, tangled in sheets and each other, Abigail traced patterns on his chest, her head resting over his still racing heart. "When did you first know?" she asked softly. "That your body was working again?" Brian smiled, pulling her closer. "Remember when I walked in on you after your shower?" She looked up at him, eyes wide. "That was months ago." "I know. I felt something then, but I was scared to hope. Scared it was a fluke. So I tested it, went to a private club, had other women try to. You know, nothing. Not even close. But thinking about you that night, immediate response." He kissed her forehead. "My body knew before my mind caught up. It was always you, Abigail. Only you." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I was terrified," he admitted. "Terrified it would stop working. Terrified I'd disappoint you. Terrified of feeling this much for someone again after everything that happened with Stephanie. But you were worth the fear. You are worth everything." Abigail kissed him softly. "We're going to be okay, aren't we?" "Better than okay," Brian promised. "We're going to be extraordinary." 3 weeks later, Abigail stood in their bathroom, staring at a pregnancy test with 2 pink lines. Her hands were shaking. This was impossible. The doctors had said Brian had very low sperm quality, that natural conception would be extremely difficult. They'd barely been together, hadn't been trying for anything. And yet, "Abigail, you okay in there?" She opened the door to find Brian leaning against the wall, concern on his face. Wordlessly, she held up the test. Brian stared at it, his expression cycling through shock, disbelief, and then pure, overwhelming joy. We're pregnant," she confirmed, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know how, but..." He swept her into his arms, spinning her around, both of them laughing and crying simultaneously. "We're having a baby," he kept repeating, like he couldn't quite believe it. "We're actually having a baby." The doctor's appointment the next week confirmed it. Dr. Helena Winters, Nuente, the same fertility specialist who'd given Brian such grim news a year ago, reviewed the test results with a surprised smile. He'd flown her into the country specifically for this. "Congratulations," she said warmly. "You're about 4 weeks along. And Mr. Kingston, I have to say, your recent sperm analysis is remarkably improved. Whatever changes you've made in your lifestyle, reduced stress, better diet, whatever it is, it's working." Brian squeezed Abigail's hand, and they shared a knowing look. Love, it turned out, was the best medicine. That night, on their balcony under the stars, Brian got down on one knee. "I don't have a ring yet," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "And this probably isn't the romantic proposal you deserve. But I can't wait another moment. Abigail Johnson, you walked into my life. Or rather, I walked into yours, and you changed everything. You healed parts of me I didn't know were broken. You made me believe in love again, in myself again. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Abigail said through happy tears. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." They got married a month later in a small ceremony at City Hall, with only Brian's immediate family, Ted, flying in from London, Jerry, and Abigail's family present. No media circus, no society expectations, just two people who loved each other making promises they intended to keep. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Abigail's doctor was slightly concerned by the rapid growth. At the 20-week ultrasound, they discovered why. "Triplets," the technician said, pointing at the screen. "2 boys and a girl. Congratulations." Brian nearly fainted. Abigail just laughed. 9 months after that positive test, Abigail gave birth to 3 healthy babies, James, William, and Charlotte Kingston. The media went insane when the news broke, speculating wildly about everything from the speed of Brian's remarriage to the miraculous nature of the triplets, given his reported fertility issues. Brian didn't care. Let them speculate. Let them write whatever stories they wanted. He had everything that mattered. On a quiet evening 2 weeks after bringing the babies home, Brian stood in the nursery, holding Charlotte while James and William slept in their cribs. Abigail appeared in the doorway, watching him with that soft smile he loved. "You're a natural," she said quietly. "I'm terrified," he admitted. 3 tiny humans depending on us. It's overwhelming. We'll figure it out together." She came to stand beside him, wrapping her arm around his waist. "Just like we figured out everything else." Brian looked down at his daughter's tiny face, then at his sleeping sons, then at the woman who'd given him all of this. A year and a half ago, he'd been broken, alone, convinced his life was over. He'd fled to New York, seeking escape, and found salvation instead. "Sometimes love doesn't just heal the heart," he said softly, repeating words he'd once heard. "It heals everything else too." Abigail rested her head on his shoulder. "Everything," she agreed. Through the nursery window, New York City sparkled with a million lights, each one a story, each one a life. And in this small apartment that had once been a battlefield and become a sanctuary, the Kingston family, chaotic, unexpected, perfectly imperfect, began their next chapter together.